I've just spent 10 days in Sri Lanka and I was genuinely amazed by the country. In this video, I'll explain why you should add Sri Lanka to your list of places to travel to, why even though it's an amazing place to travel to, I probably wouldn't want to set up there long term,
and why I think even though Sri Lanka is already established in tourism, I think it's only going to increase in the next 5 to 10 years.
Now, the first thing I was completely blown away by and shocked by in Sri Lanka is the landscape and scenery. I've always known Sri Lanka, or thought Sri Lanka would be very nice to visit and be a interesting place, but I didn't quite realise how beautiful the place would be. In central Sri Lanka, near to Yala, I was blown away by the mountains, the walks, the waterfalls, the monkeys and everything in between. It's picturesque, it looks like a postcard, and if you stay in certain places for a reasonable price, you can have a view that people would pay hundreds and hundreds of dollars for just for one night to stay there. Yet you can get it for a very affordable amount. Not only do you have the landscape and natural beauty, but you also have the wildlife. You have a chance of seeing wild leopards in Sri Lanka. You have a chance of seeing elephants and snakes and lots of different monkeys and mongoose and everything in between. The place is spoilt for nature, and even when you're driving around, you'll see signs saying crocodiles crossing here, or elephants crossing, or leopards crossing. There's so many national parks scattered around the country, you could spend weeks, if not months, just going to the national parks alone. That, even though we went to one national park, if I was to go back, I would split my time up and go to several, because I've heard only good things, and our experience of the national park that we visited was amazing as well. So we mainly traveled the south of the island. We've done a big loop of the south of Sri Lanka. We pretty much visited around half the country, so there's still half that we haven't seen, but in that half we saw beach towns that had a little bit of a feeling of being in a mini Bali, and that was called Marissa down in the south. It was a big surf town, and you had a lot of little hipster cafes, you know, like vegan fruit bowls and all that jazz. Then the further east you went, you had Yala National Park that looked completely different again. It looked like you were on a safari in Africa with flat plains and bushland and lots of wildlife and just a complete different look to it. Then you went to the centre with Ella, where it's very mountainous and the roads are windy, lots of waterfalls. Then you had Kandy, which is a city a few hours away from Ella that just had a complete different feel to it. And then you had Colombo, which is the main city and the one that you'll fly into if you visit Sri Lanka, which has a completely non-touristy feel about it and is unique in its own right, albeit not my favourite place, but it's unique. And then you had Negombo, which is a little seaside town which is very close to the airport, that has nice restaurants, places to drink and eat, and a few nice places to stay. So you have so much variety in the places to visit, and like I mentioned, we only visited less than half of the country. Another big draw of Sri Lanka is the food. The food is very good, it's well known for its food, so we weren't surprised by that, but it was still very, very tasty and interesting to actually eat Sri Lankan food in Sri Lanka versus our own take of it back in UK or Europe. A lot of it was rice based, a lot of rotis, a lot of dal, a lot of rice-based meals, a lot of biryani. It was very nice, definitely one of the nicer cuisines I've tried in their home country, and it's a huge draw of Sri Lanka. Depending on where you go, you can get different types of food. For example, we went to a buffet and you could pick lots of different food. One slight downfall I personally found is the meat options are a little bit limited, and as somebody that likes to eat a high protein diet, that was a slight drawback. In 10 days I think I had probably the same amount of protein as I usually have in maybe a day or two. A slight addition with the food that I forgot to mention is, even though the food's amazing, for some reason when you order a drink we would have to give them a little nudge and say, where's our water, even though our food's already arrived. And another factor that would draw me to actually recommend Sri Lanka and was a nice part of being there is the people were super friendly and super helpful. No matter where we went, we felt that across the country. People will always tell you this. I've never been to a country where somebody on YouTube has sat there said the people there are horrible, you should go there. You never hear that. You always hear everyone's nice, but the people in Sri Lanka genuinely were very friendly and very helpful.
Sri Lankan, my name is Mohammed. Welcome to all of the European, all the world people, welcome to Sri Lanka. I hope you welcome to.
Which is a nice addition to visiting somewhere, and it's a good factor of visiting somewhere for the first time. When you've been somewhere a bunch of times and you're very familiar with the place, you don't need people to be as helpful because you already know your way around. But when visiting a place for the first time, it's always nice to have a very helpful and friendly population that are there, so you feel quite comfortable and you can get into the swing of things pretty quickly. Now, in terms of cost, this is a very, very budget friendly travel destination. Very. In terms of everywhere I've traveled to, I would say Sri Lanka's probably top 3 in terms of budget friendly travel. And if you were on a very extremely tight budget, you could get by for so little there. For example, accommodation for 2 people in a reasonable place, not a high-end budget, but a reasonable place that you're comfortable in for the night, would cost somewhere in the region of about 20 to 30 US dollars. You could easily get that down if you didn't care the kind of quality that you slept in, or if you were staying in hostels. Taxis were extremely cheap again, or tuk-tuk rides were extremely cheap. You're looking probably somewhere in the region of $1 to $5 for a taxi ride of somewhere in between 10 to 40 minutes. So food you could make very reasonably priced. Again, like I said, I like my protein, like my meat, so sometimes my meals are a little bit more expensive. If you're eating in more Western places, you can look for the price to be marked up, and it can really go from £5 per person, or about $7 US per person, up to 20 to 30 US per person, depending on where you're eating. However, if you're eating local, in local restaurants and local food, you can get very good deals for very good food and very authentic food for a very reasonable price. And we found this trend across the board in Sri Lanka. The more Western or the more touristy of a place we ate, the more expensive. But the more expensive didn't add up to the better meal. Quite often the cheaper meals and the cheaper restaurants were the better food that we ate. Now, getting around in Sri Lanka is super easy. The main ones are going to be train, bus and tuk-tuk, and then you can hire a private driver as well. I'm not going to go into full depth on this because I've got a separate video explaining how to get around Sri Lanka and what I recommend in that. But in summary, I would suggest catching a train at some point, and they can be good. They're certainly cheap. I wouldn't recommend buses because even though they're cheap, they're hot, sweaty, and just if you've got a lot of luggage with you, it's a little bit stressful. And in my opinion, unless you're traveling long term and on a really tight budget, I would avoid buses. What I would recommend is renting a tuk-tuk. We rented a tuk-tuk from tuktukrental.com. The experience was great, the service was great, the tuk-tuk was great, and it gave us a lot of flexibility to travel where we wanted to, and for a very good price. One nice and surprising factor about the weather in Sri Lanka was that it wasn't quite as humid as what I thought. And depending on where you go around the country, you will have different seasons. And we've gone to the south of the country, which I believe between November, December to around March is the best time to go, and you're more guaranteed to have sunshine and less humidity, less rain. But during this time when we were there, what we found was in the morning and in the evening you had a nice cool temperature. In the daytime you had a sunny and drier heat, less humidity, and then because you had the cooler temperature in the evening, you got this genuine feeling of fresh air. Language also isn't an issue in Sri Lanka. Most people speak at least some English, and a lot of people speak a very good level of English. So getting around, communicating, booking things, ordering stuff at restaurants, speaking with people at your hotel, etc., or just locals that you meet, you can have a proper conversation with them, and quite often they have a very good level of English, which is a nice perk when you're traveling. Now, what I mentioned earlier about not wanting or not feeling like I was drawn to Sri Lanka to live there or be there longer term, which is always a little calculation I make in my head. Would I want to be here, or could I imagine myself here longer term? Being a digital nomad and working online and moving around, no matter where I go, whether it's for a holiday, to travel there longer term, to pass through, even for a city break, I'm always thinking, could I imagine myself living here? And Sri Lanka is a no from the 10 days I went there. I would love to go back, and I plan to go back, and I will go back to visit more national parks and visit more of the country. However, to stay there longer term, a few things that stood out for me. Number one, the Wi-Fi is not amazing. It's not quite as bad as what I thought it would be, given some of the other YouTube videos that I'd watched and some of the blogs I'd read. Maybe they've improved that in recent times, or maybe I just got lucky. But there is that. It's not as good as some other places I've visited in Asia. Number two, and it might sound a little bit funny, but the driving style is not something I'd want to immerse myself in, day out. Even though it's fine to get around, and I drove a tuk-tuk for near on the full time we were there, it was fine and we got by with no incidents, and it was sound. But would I want to drive there like that long term? Probably not. A little bit too mad for me, so the driving is a little bit of a downside. And the food, even though it is amazing and it is very tasty, the lack of protein, or the higher difficulty I had finding higher protein meals or slightly lower on the rice, was a little bit difficult. So I could imagine if I was there longer term, I'd probably just get fat and skinny at the same time. And finally, the gyms and the fitness scene. Maybe it was there and we just didn't see it, but there didn't seem to be that much going on in that respect for me to want to be there long term, or at least feel like I could find gyms or Muay Thai or martial arts gyms or kind of functional fitness gyms to actually train in. There probably is, and I imagine Sri Lanka does have its share of gyms that are good around the place. I just didn't see as much of it. So if I'm wrong on that, do correct me, but I just didn't come across it. This is why I believe Sri Lanka still has a lot of room for growth with tourism. It's had its fair share of difficulties and challenges, both for the country, for tourism, and then the pandemic as well. So I think now those things are in the past and there's a lot more stability there, and the country is becoming increasingly more appealing to a wider audience. I think the numbers will just continue to grow, and I also think that the more infrastructure there is there and the more time that passes, because of the variety that Sri Lanka has with the beaches, the national parks, the landscape, the food, and the great people, I think tourism numbers will continue to grow. So now is probably the best time to go and visit. Guys, as always, I appreciate you tuning in. I hope you found this video useful or interesting. If you disagree with anything I had to say, or you want to add anything, please drop a comment down below, and I will catch you in the next one. Peace.